Awesome. Hey, everybody. We are going to get started here. If y'all can sit down and get to your seats. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for Yale School Management for hosting this very cool summit. Few of us on the panel, actually, I guess one of us on the panel has been here and had a very successful time last year, so hopefully we can keep that up. So welcome everybody to the Civic Track. This is a conversation about the housing crisis and where innovation can fit into some of the very exciting trends happening on the policy side. I'm not going to do big intros just to have the most time for the conversation. Everybody is up behind us. But I did actually just want to get a pulse. We asked to calibrate as we were discussing this panel. I'm assuming everybody that's here has some interest in housing, is aware there's this housing shortage in the millions of homes in all kinds of shades. But just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you've heard of the YIMBY movement. Okay, cool. Now keep them up if you consider yourself a YIMBY. Okay, I would assume so in an innovative audience that there are a lot of folks that want to say yes. That's really helpful because what we really want to talk about today is that ideal bridge of innovation on the policy side, innovation on the private sector side, the philanthropy side, nonprofit side. We have a long way to go in terms of solving this crisis, and any number of solutions are necessary. Just as a baseline, want to give you all some context. We are fixing zoning is a declarative statement. I think there's some nuance to that. We are beginning to fix zoning. The YIMBY movement, for folks that are not familiar with it, 10, 15 years, this has been evolving, really starting at the municipal level, leading up to the state level, and groups that were facing housing shortages in places where they wanted to live and work and thrive were activated. And the YIMBY movement, as a broad, very generalization thesis statement, has identified that zoning is a major barrier to solving the housing crisis. And zoning is the local decisions about what can be built, where it can be built. And the YIMBY movement broadly has identified this as one of the major, though not the exclusive, barrier to getting the kind of housing that our market demands, our population, our workforce demands. And it has been very successful, slowly but surely, in a number of different states, blue states, red states, purple states. There have been some very exciting policy innovations undoing some of the exclusionary zoning that has limited what can be built. And we've seen some success in places where a bill passed a few years ago has unleashed the market to build a very particular type of housing. And we've identified building more density, more multifamily apartments, particularly around transit stations, as a really big key part of the movement. So that's all well and good. We've had success slowly but surely. It's still a big political narrative. It's still a big challenge from a bureaucratic side. But there are other issues that we have to face that we want to solve the crisis. It's financing, it's building code, it's construction productivity, among other things. And what we're brought today is a couple of different folks on some very different spectrums of involvement in the housing crisis to have a conversation about innovation specifically. We've got Abdul from New Haven, who's a city planner, who's going to lead off. And I think a lot of folks are probably more on the private sector of things. So we want to start with, Abdul, as someone that's a Yale alum, living in New Haven, dealing with zoning changes. New Haven is a city that wants to build, wants to see growth. Where do you still see some of the barriers, and how does a city government innovate to partner with private sector, nonprofit sector?
Happy to start, and everyone can hear me. Turn the mic on. Good, cool. So I think one of the great things is actually, I will point him out. Eitan, who's one of the SOM students who's here, is one of our fellows that we had at the city plan department this semester, him and another student, Holly, did great research on what are some of our zoning barriers, particularly what do we see go to our Board of Zoning Appeals, the board of, volunteer or appointed members who vote on if you can break the rules a little bit of the zoning. And we found that 80% or more of the variances and requests being made were accepted by our board within the last few years, which is to say, we all know that there's forms of housing development that occur that we're comfortable with, but we've not set the rules to be aligned with that. And so we're doing this thing where we're adding 2 or 3 months to a process for something we're ultimately going to say yes to. I think one of the simple, innovative things is to get out of our own way and analyze what do we always say yes to in the first place? That means that's actually the form and structure and set of uses that we're comfortable with. I think a deeper look, and as someone who went to design school, as the way that I learned planning was understanding kind of design envelope approaches to zoning. Don't think purely about the ways that all of your minor setbacks, distance of ratios of walls to the property line, the heights in a lot of these different ways as like very minute regulations that limit what you can build, but actually think about the broader envelope that you're fitting this use, this housing business into, that allows for people like architects and designers to do things flexibly that actually help to build the quote character of communities in the first place. What we actually have right now are a lot of very minor and frustrating regulations that are, the subsection of the subsection that tells you that you actually can't build something that is the same thing as what's across the street from you. We find that most of the properties that are in New Haven are zoning non-compliant. They all do not meet the zoning that was made. They were all built before the zoning was made, and somebody decided we're never going to see those ones again. We have a vision of something that will be made that's not buildable. And so I think one of the kind of stronger ways that we can approach this is pretty simple in making those adjustments. I think the other way, which you kind of started off with, is a kind of zoning plus approach. We can change all of those rules, and then we actually have to innovate on the education towards community members to be involved in then acting on those. So if we are making better ways that people can go about building, you have to build a class of small-scale builders in your community. They're not going to just kind of jump to it if they don't have the financing available, if they don't know how to still go through the other more necessary steps of a regulatory process. And so if you make it possible for someone who's doing everything from the ADU to a 3 or 4 unit building to make that possible for a community member who's been struggling to find ways to build wealth, that's going to kind of add to the quality of what that zoning is actually doing, as opposed to make something that's really tight and restrained and not give anyone a way to know how to act and be involved in that in the first place.
And for folks that might not know, New Haven is undergoing a very large, probably in generations, the largest rezoning. You're going out in the community, talking a lot about the vision for what New Haven is. And, where are you getting pushback? There, of course, are folks, NIMBYs is a term that's broadly of no, but there's obviously nuances to that. But what are you seeing for folks in New Haven now? How aware are they of zoning as a barrier? How open to they are innovation in the public sector?
Yeah, I would say, and we're very early, we just passed in October the Vision 2034 comprehensive plan for the city, which is a 10-year plan for what we want to do. It includes a lot of these recommendations for zoning changes. And I mean, largely, when you talk about it in conversation, everyone is very supportive. The concepts of them of increasing housing and updating the rules for that is very positive. I think when you get into the minutia of that means we might remove parking minimums, that starts to get to a real discomfort that shows up in a tangible way for folks. And it's less about, I think, the actual reality of more people living in your neighborhood or the reality of what the physical forms may look like, because many of them might still look like what we see, as I mentioned. They might be just 2-3 story buildings with some more housing units. But it's the kind of other spillover effects, this idea that people come with cars, the idea that people come with noise, these kinds of concepts that are pretty easy to mitigate, I would say, and also part of the way that we regulate in the first place. We have noise ordinances, we have light ordinances, we have the things that kind of change what people feel is what makes their neighborhoods comfortable. But I think some of the pushback comes from that spillover effect of what does more population actually look like. I'd also say, too, there's a thoughtfulness that we really want to approach where there have been communities within New Haven that have absorbed more of the growth or absorbed more of the multifamily development because that's where the zoning was placed. Most of the Euclidean zoning, which is the type of zoning you will see in many of the U.S. cities that we're in, that separate things by land uses, also pushed a lot of multifamily near the most kind of industrial or heavy activity spaces, and then kept all of the single family or low density away from those spaces. And the hardest conversations are with folks who live in those areas that have now understood those to be kind of historical artifacts of areas of these single family or low density areas. But they're also the most appropriate for growth. They are most appropriate because there is space to accommodate having an expansion of those buildings. You can actually have parking in those areas because they have more land to accommodate for that. And there's avenues to be able to build towards I think the neighborhood style and feeling that people want while also permitting for more housing. So I think some of the pushback is really like, how do you make that neighborhood change in such a way that still feels comfortable? But also other neighborhoods have been doing it for the city, and everyone has to do a bit more of a fair share to accommodate that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the single family areas being the biggest resistance. I don't want to give too much away about the panel, but we may have a hack for how to make some changes On that, I want to twist over to you, Casey, and we have worked on a number of different affordable housing reports and projects and legislation, and we need millions of homes. We need all kinds of homes, publicly owned, privately owned, market rate subsidized. But there's a big distinction between what we sort of call capital A affordable housing and lowercase affordable housing. We need both, but they mean different things to different people. And frankly, the capital A affordable housing I'd love to talk to you about, of getting to that lower income level that we desperately need housing for. It's a big challenge. It's expensive right now, pretty much everywhere in the country, to build that type of housing. So, where do you see from your perch, how do you align the incentives of public policy, private capital, communities to get that capital A affordable housing built?
There we go. That's a great question, Pete. So I want to first start with the distinction between the big A and the little a. So when we're talking about that big A, capital A affordable housing, it's those public subsidy dollars that are deed restricting that unit. And that deed restriction is really driving who can live in that home. So what income levels we're aiming to reach with that. The cost of construction, I'm sure is no surprise to anyone here, is rising rapidly. It's not coming down. We're seeing affordable units cost upwards of $400,000, $500,000 in multifamily buildings. It's significant. And so when you're thinking about the public subsidies that are available, there's not enough. We are seeing projects that maybe used to only need a few funding sources between low-cost debt, public subsidies, tax credits, now are requiring significantly more numbers of sources in order to get built, and are increasing the amount of debt they have to take on, which means it limits the deep affordability that you can reach. So in the past, programs may have been able to include more units that can reach our neighbors who are living with 30% of their area median income. So these are considered extremely low income households. We're seeing fewer of those units being able to be included in developments these days, which is a problem because we know that those populations, so they're extremely low income and our very low income neighbors, have the greatest need for housing at this time. More than half of those residents are cost burdened, so they're spending 50% or more of their income on their housing. But in order to get there, we have to think strategically about how do we take these different subsidy sources? How do we stretch them farther? How do we innovate with them? So actually here in New Haven, next neighborhood over in the Dixwell neighborhood, there is an example of a low-income housing tax credit project that utilized mass timber. So while the initial costs were slightly more upfront, over the long term, it'll actually be a cheaper option for the residents as well as the developer will be owning and managing the property long term. And for those who may not be familiar, the low-income housing tax credit program is currently the main financial driver for building affordable housing in our country. It's a tax credit program out of the IRS, not a program out of HUD. A lot of people don't realize that. And so we have to kind of think about how do we support innovative solutions. We can use these public subsidy sources for that, but it's also thinking about how do we reach additional developers because there's only so much subsidy to go around. So at LISC, we try to think about ways to encourage private capital investment, to offer low-cost debt to developers, with really the aim in mind to reach those very low-income households.
I'm glad you brought up the mass timber development because almost counterintuitively, because at least there is, I don't want to call it guaranteed, but there is more public capital for affordable programs in some cases, that there is sometimes an opportunity to innovate in a way because it's a little bit easier to get some of that funding in. NYCHA in New York City is experimenting with heat pumps. Even Elm City's community as a public housing authority in New Haven is experimenting with mixed income, market rate, and under restricted housing. But I mean, where do you see the biggest bang for the buck of the public sector, and how do you get to that extra private sector involvement? What innovation are they scared of right now? What innovation are they into right now?
That's a great question. So what we're seeing is that the Department of Housing here in Connecticut is really interested in trying to support those public-private partnerships. They've invested in some different financing vehicles to spur private development. As Abdul was noting earlier around the need for even 3-4 unit buildings, right? As we think about different neighborhoods and building opportunities, infill development, these aren't large projects, but they can serve a very important purpose in communities. So on the other side of the big A affordable is little a affordable, which we often think of as our naturally occurring affordable housing. So these are the units that don't have a subsidy behind them, but are typically available to our neighbors who are earning anywhere from, the 80% to 120% of area median income. A lot of folks refer to that as workforce housing because those individuals don't typically qualify for subsidies or other subsidized units, but those units are still very expensive to build. And so what we're seeing was a gap, that we had developers who could reach up to 80% area median income utilizing public sources, or it was the other end where it was what we're seeing more luxury housing that's affordable to folks at 150% or higher of that area median income. And it left a gap for a lot of our neighbors who are really struggling to find affordable, healthy, safe place to live. So our Department of Housing here has invested in a program to encourage private developers to build market rate housing, but incorporating units that are available to that gap, that middle 80 to 120 that was getting left behind. The affordability restrictions on it are a little less than what we typically see. It's only 5 years. So still a little bit more we need to do with that. But it was really recognizing that the private sector has an important role to play in building housing. And so how do we do that? And often it's through the financing. But I think the other piece to that too is the regulations, right? Making sure that it is easier to build. So many communities, the zoning can be a barrier. And in certain places, they've been more open to it. In other communities, not as much. And so it's about preserving those tools and mechanisms we have here in our state to allow and encourage multifamily housing and really be kind of pushing that from the state level.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. And you mentioned the financing costs are going up for any number of reasons, but it's harder already to build a multifamily apartment building today than it was 6 months ago, 2 years ago, and it potentially could be harder. And turning to Nick here, one of the major challenges I think the movement and folks have recognized is there has been a phenomenal lack of innovation in the construction industry. That wood frame stencil housing is still pretty much what has been produced. And there are attempts to figure out ways on the back end of that financing stack. How do you reduce the cost of materials going in, the time for design approvals, the on-site production? And Nick, if you could first tell us a little bit about your company and maybe even a little bit of the story, how you came to this thesis statement. But we're also interested once you get to that of, innovators, entrepreneurs are not thinking about zoning regulations and policy as the go-to thing they wake up in the morning to solve the problem of. But obviously you interact with that a lot. So we're curious, as someone who's innovating and frankly doing new stuff in a stuffy space, what are the challenges of bringing in new ideas? But let's start with talking a little bit about what you're actually working on.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. Definitely appreciate it. Yeah. So Veristruct is taking a different approach to the way that we construct housing. And so the way that we do it, we approach it from a comfort lens first. And so what do I mean by comfort? When we talk about zoning, a lot of the zoning that's gone in place today is because people weren't comfortable with certain things. So we're talking about setbacks, a certain population that might move in based on a certain structure that's being built, et cetera. And a lot of this was discriminatory, et cetera. We're trying to undo these wrongs now, but it's really entrenched in the way that we build, even from a construction lens and a building code standpoint as well, not just zoning. And so if you want to approach housing, and there hasn't been a shortage of innovation in construction, there's been a shortage of innovation that's actually getting adopted. So there's a key differentiator there. And so we're thinking, okay, if this innovation that's tried to get on the market for the last 100 years hasn't gone on the market, why is that the case? And it comes down to comfort, right? We do things a certain way, and we like to see a certain type of structure in a community. So how do we build a structure that people are comfortable with? From a structural standpoint, they're comfortable with the way that the load paths are set up. Like somebody inspecting the building will be able to understand it and approve, but it could still be built a lot quicker, a lot more affordably, and also give an aesthetic that people feel dignified living within. And so that is the lens that Veristruct started from. And so my background, my dad's a construction worker. He's worked on walls for 40 plus years, right? And so I saw construction when I was a little kid. I, worked summers growing up with him. And even when I graduated high school, thought I was going to go into construction, but a lucky break. Ended up through a nonprofit, ended up going to Princeton for a full ride, which opened a ton of doors for me, but I saw the other side. And I saw that construction was not changing. Like I would go visit my dad back home, work, during winter break with him. The same thing as when I was a little kid. And why is that the case? He's doing the same repetitive task over and over and over again. And it's not for lack of enjoyment. Construction workers actually find fulfillment in that work because they get to see a tangible result of their efforts, right? But even, the construction worker that feels fulfilled has other consequences on their body. Also, there's a shortage of labor right now. 41% of the construction workforce is expected to retire by 2031. And so those people that felt fulfilled in the past won't be coming back in the future because they're retiring. And then also, our generation right now does not want to work in construction. It's just a sad truth. And so how do we fill this gap while also meeting the comfort of communities? And so taking a first principles standpoint from an engineering point of view that I learned and developed at SpaceX when I was there before, we approached this problem from material to job site and then thinking about load paths. And so when we construct, we actually use a robot that's depositing each layer of the house that's been pre-approved already. And so we're slicing the footprints like a 3D printer. We're slicing the footprint. This footprint's been approved by the community we're working with. We also route MEP within the walls and see exactly where that's going to go, make sure that's bought off as well. And then as we're printing the walls, we're assessing exactly where we said we were going to print to where we actually printed. And we create a tolerance report that's very easy for inspectors to digest and understand. And then from a code perspective, we're thinking about how do we match existing code with this new process. And so ACI 318 and 319 for post-beam and masonry construction are the big drivers within the International Building Code and International Residential Code that dictate how structures go up and how they are safe, right? And if you try to change that right now with such an early technology, even with any of these new like modular or other construction 3D printing companies, if you try to push that now, you're going to get a lot of pushback there. Then also from the aesthetic standpoint, if you're printing with a way that makes ridge lines within the walls, you might get some NIMBYism. And then also from the zoning standpoint, you can only build in certain locations. So there's a lot of different problems you have to tackle. And so how do you make it such that it's comfortable and easy to build? And so our approach uses a slip form method, which creates smooth walls, sharp corners. We apply finish and paint as we're printing. And that creates an aesthetic that people are comfortable with and actually feel dignified living within. Like it doesn't feel like an affordable housing unit, even though it's a lot more affordable to construct. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but that's kind of like the approach that we're taking right now.
Well, you brought up building codes, building inspectors. Are there any building inspectors or fire marshals here? Okay, good, because they're kind of the villains in a lot of this innovation stuff. We had a single stair building code reform in Connecticut. We passed it in law 2 years ago. It got killed by fire marshals and a bunch of stuff. And to your point, it's, I think, incredibly smart, actually. Water like concrete, don't fight certain regulations now. The novelty of what you're doing really meets a lot of barriers. You certainly mentioned NIMBYism, but it is the bureaucracy that does not necessarily understand innovation and new pieces. And as much as I'm harping on them, there are hard-earned lessons of fire code and building code safety, and there's a reason for a lot of the code, but technology has improved. We have innovated fire suppression technologies. There are new materials and new methodology, but there's still quite a bit of bureaucracy that's kind of struggling with that. Just as a follow-up question on that code question specifically, I think it's smart to just, hey, this is what the code is. Let's go pitch a building inspector now and what that is. I know you guys are early stages, but what is that dynamic right now with you do have this novel piece, and what are you dealing with from the bureaucratic side in those conversations?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So to be transparent, we raised a round in September of last year. We're still developing the technology, right? So we're very early stage. Even then, we're having conversations every week with building inspectors, with cities, making sure they know about our technology and that we're developing the technology around code compliance rather than developing a solution and trying to impart it on a community that's not ready for it. And so we are tweaking our design based on their feedback. And we recently adjusted the way that our structure is built from a structural load path standpoint. Even though it's a little bit less efficient, It's something that is going to get built 6 to 12 months sooner than the way that we were baselining it because it matches that code. Right? So starting those conversations really early is, I think, an issue that a lot of these innovative construction companies have not done. And it's kind of hurting them now, and they're really trying to push and lobby. But it takes time to have these changes enacted. And so starting early, having those conversations early, building around as much comfortability and compliance as possible as early as you can. And then whatever else is left over, that's where you like prove it out in the field. Right? People want to see something built, so you have to show them, right? This is safe. This is how we piloted it. This is like the ringer that we put it through in terms of like structural tests. Now that you're comfortable with it, let's proceed with a pilot in a community that somebody will live in first.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So I want to turn to Missy, and thanks for hanging in there. It's always tough as the last first person to go. So Missy's in the philanthropy world, and I must say, you guys fund Turner Center, which is one of the great leaders of thought and research in the YIMBY movement. They just hosted the California primary for governor not that long ago with Ezra Klein. So you're doing some very, very cool stuff as a wonk. You sit in an interesting place because you manage, kind of private sector, or I guess family funding, and also the philanthropy side of it. So you're doing a lot in housing. What is your strategy, and what strategy do you think philanthropy specifically can play along the spectrum of, disrupting the housing shortage?
Well, thank you, Pete. And I love going last because I get to learn from my co-panelists. This is really fun. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in housing. As Pete mentioned, I'm CEO of Crankstart, which is a very large foundation based in the Bay Area. Bay Area has a lot of challenges. Housing is certainly among them. So a large amount of our funding does go towards housing, about $50 million each year. And to your question on where does foundation capital, where does philanthropic catalytic capital fit into this, we see philanthropic dollars as society's risk capital. And if we're not taking enough risk, then who has the privilege of being able to do that? I think a challenge with many philanthropies is that they try to kind of count their success in the things that you can see. And the power of innovation is that often you can't really see it. You can't really look at the number of people you're housing or the number of people whose potential entry into homelessness was prevented. You just need to trust that this is the innovation that's going to be able to spark good things into the future, and it's kind of out of vogue for many foundations. Luckily, it's in vogue for ours. So I'll paint a picture of just a couple of innovative things we have funded that we're really proud of, and we see this as our role because, again, government capital can't do this. Private capital isn't going to get a return from doing it, so what better capital than philanthropic capital? One example is we fund something called the Housing Accelerator Fund, and the basic problem to solve is that often when housing exists and it needs preservation, it needs to be improved, it's really hard to get the government funding to do that. So, for example, Housing Accelerator Fund recently provided the bridge capital for the preservation of SROs, single-room occupancies in Chinatown in San Francisco. Really dilapidated, in great need of refurbishment. And the problem was that at the beginning, the appraisal value was around $20 million. And at the end, the appraisal value was going to be around $90 million. But city funding would be based on the appraisal value at start, and it simply wouldn't be enough funding to fund the refurbishment needed. And so Housing Accelerator Fund comes in with these short-term bridge loans that can start immediately, don't need a million approvals, environmental and otherwise. It's just quick capital. It enables that flywheel to start where you can do the preservation work. And then when it's over, it's capital that's actually taken out and refinanced with public funding. That capital doesn't exist, right? It's high risk, it's low return, but it is magic when you want to look at a preservation project and really get it going. Another funding that we're really proud of is Turner Center, as you mentioned. Turner Center creates the research that is the basis for a lot of the policy that actually gets papered. Turner Center has published 150 reports on housing. They are the ones that first in 2019 pointed to the fact that it costs $450,000 for a single unit of housing to be made in California. It was this jaw-dropping moment. But because they're such a credible policy house, it's really important to have that research. And you see them cited in the New York Times, and you see them cited in government hearings. And therefore, it's important for philanthropic capital to fund it. The last and final example I'll point to is using capital in a way that will unlock private market capital in a way that it is meant to exist while catalyzing great changes for the community. And an example of this is we funded the Catalyst Impact Fund, which took luxury housing in San Jose. Casey educated us about how sometimes in areas there's an oversupply of luxury housing and an undersupply of workforce housing. That's actually precisely what's happening in San Jose right now. So we were able to go into a building in San Jose and effectively flip it into affordable housing. So 20% at 50% AMI, 80% at 80% AMI. And we were able to do that with a $90 million purchase price, most of which was funded in the private bond market. And then Crankstart came in with $10 million, which is the highest risk part of the capital stack, the lowest return, because we're a philanthropy. We were happy to take a 3% return to be the highest risk. And it meant that the bond market could solve for the entire rest of the capital stack, meaning you don't necessarily need government funding or philanthropic funding to make it work. You could just provide that little bit of secret sauce at the end to unlock, in this case, 168 units of affordable housing that are desperately needed in an area. So to answer your question, as a philanthropy, we feel like we have a real responsibility to innovation and to funding the innovators in the community that see something that others don't, and to work with the experts who are deeply community-centric and understand that a little bit of capital that's not chasing a return can go a really far way.
Yeah, very, very cool breakdown of some of the really cool gaps that you're filling. And I guess just as a follow-up question, you guys have a very specific strategy and you found a really interesting niche at scaling up. What would your advice be to other philanthropy caring about the housing crisis that maybe are a little bit more metric based on kind of the end user units? Like, would you encourage them to think more like your strategy and take those risks? Do you think, what would you be excited about for other philanthropy to take on?
Wouldn't that be amazing if we could? Going back to an initial thing you said, I actually am CEO of the family office and CEO of this family's foundation, which is really unique. I'm a Yale alum. Most of my career has been in investing and investment banking and private equity. And so running the family office and running the foundation is something that usually doesn't happen. And here's the challenge that results from it. Usually the person running the family office is chasing ROI and is getting paid based on the portfolio they manage and that portfolio's performance. And then the person running the foundation can only write C3 grants to nonprofits. And I think what's really interesting about the way that most of the world is set up is that when you have lots of capital, but half of it is chasing a return and half of it can only write to C3 checks to C3s, which is oversimplifying it a bit. There's some innovative things you could do from a foundation, but you miss a lot of what can happen in the middle. And so, for example, we are funding a for-profit developer who is really community-centric, who is able to build workforce housing very quickly, very efficiently, has a completely vertically integrated team, but we're doing it with for-profit low ROI capital that just many ecosystems don't have the person to go to do that. And so I think my answer to your question of, how would you inspire foundations to think about taking innovation, I actually think it's a little bit broader than that. It's usually a foundation is pegged to a very wealthy family or source, and that very wealthy family or source has an adjacent family office arm. It's getting those two people to work together. And it's been a real privilege to see what kind of the connective tissue can unlock that's hard for most wealthy enterprises.
Well, I mean, it's great having a model for other folks to look at that is doing that successfully. And as someone who is excited about doing more of this work and always needs more funding in the nonprofit sector, I'm sure Casey's the same way. Like, it's exciting to see you as an example, and we're hoping other folks do that. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes before we're going to open up for questions, and I want to have a little bit more of a rapid fire question. We are obviously talking about some specific strategies here, and Nick's project particularly, but just to raise your hands, who has heard of an ADU before, an accessory dwelling unit? Okay, that's very helpful. Good. Who has lived in an ADU before? Is anybody? I don't want to put anyone on the spot necessarily, but okay, that is an interesting a spread. So this is what we often talk about in the movement as the gateway drug to YIMBYism, is the accessory dwelling unit. To what we had said earlier with Abdul of there's a lot of resistance for some of these ideas in single family residences, which by some measures is 65, 75% of land in America. So that's a big part of this. ADUs are a really interesting case study of the need for regulatory changes, the need for financing changes, for technology changes. So I want to start with you, Casey, first. Why does LISC think ADUs are so important for that capital A and lowercase a?
Yeah, so when we think about the lowercase a, the little a affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing, we're often looking at smaller residences. ADUs are a great example. We think about basement apartments, older, smaller, single family homes. Those are the kinds of things that we find with naturally occurring affordable housing. And they play an important role because they create additional choice and opportunity in communities. And with accessory dwelling units, in 2021, Connecticut passed legislation that would allow for ADUs, but at the 11th hour included an opt-out for communities. And wouldn't you know, a lot of communities opted out.
About 67% of them.
Yeah. So that was a challenge, right? Because it was presenting an opportunity to say, hey, here's a way that we can think about an approach that would have a statewide impact. And then kind of within those first couple of years, as Pete noted, the majority of these communities opted out. Many of them went on to pass their own local regulations around ADUs to try to conform a bit more to what was happening in their community. And some places took it even further and said, we'll allow you to do 2 ADUs on your property if the second one is deed restricted affordable, right? Kind of went in all these different directions. But from our perspective, as we're thinking about how do we promote development, right? We have this massive shortage. We have to think about all these different strategies, and ADUs can help create gentle density in these largely single family neighborhoods. When we look at the zoning map for Connecticut, we see that, at the time, I believe it was 4% was zoned as 2% allows multifamily as of right. Only 2% of the land in Connecticut. So how are we going to get to the number of units we need? We need to approach it from all sides. So ADUs can really help us in these single family neighborhoods. And we're thinking about it of how do we scale different programs, both technical assistance programs to connect residents with architects, help local planning officials really understand how to support residents in building an ADU, folks who may know nothing about the construction or development process. And then also from a financing side, construction is still expensive, as we've talked about. So how do we think about ways to incentivize homeowners who have the ability to put an ADU on their property? How do we help them get across the finish line with affordable tools, whether it's grant funding or low-cost financing or tax abatements, right? There's a number of ways we can approach it, but it's hard to do that when we have 169 towns here and there's nearly 169 different pathways for folks to go to get them built. It makes it really difficult to scale solutions. So we do need to think about how do we support communities in understanding that there's a benefit to them to streamlining, to changing their zoning so that it fits more of a statewide regulation, kind of working with our state agencies to help them kind of get on board with understanding the power behind investing in creating pre-approved design plans that are available to homeowners, with our local state financing agency, how they can create a tool that will allow potentially even moderate income homeowners to take out financing to build that ADU, which can generate additional rental income, but then also create a place for someone to age in their community. That's another real challenge. We have seniors who are looking to downsize, but they don't want to leave the place that's been their home for 20, 30, 40 years, but there's nowhere to go, right? So they talk about how they would like to see an ADU, in their backyard so that they would have a place to go and can rent out their home or have other family move in. So there's a lot of benefits to supporting them in our communities.
And you've spoken to some of the different audiences for ADUs, and this is really a question for you, Nick. And you talked about comfort, and I really like that. That's a good, slick term to really say we need to make people comfortable with this. But there are two audiences, and Casey brought this up. There's the homeowner that needs to build the thing on their property, and then there's a person that we want to live in that. And you're obviously dealing with both, but where do you think you spend most of your time thinking about how to get this type of technology in the backyard of somebody's house? Is it the homeowner to buy it, or is it the person that needs to rent in it? And Maybe that's a silly question to ask. I don't know.
Great question. I mean, definitely both. You need to consider both points of view. What's most important in my mind is getting it built in a way that's safe. Like, step one, if you can get pre-approved plans for ADUs in communities, that's great. That's a great first step, because then it's like you're reducing the mental burden for some of these people that are approving the plans to be like, okay, we already have these pre-approved plans, right? And those plans ideally have already been vetted so that homeowners and the people that would live in the ADUs are comfortable in those ADUs, right? So like that's kind of like what we think about there. And we're trying to push for communities to adopt pre-approved plans, ideally with Veristruct's technology down the line. But we got to start somewhere, right? But in terms of that comfort level, I think, if you build a structure such as an ADU in a way that matches the architecture of the home, that the ADUs being like that site that the home's built on, and then the other architecture in the community, then I think naturally people will just feel more comfortable in that, whether it's the homeowner or the person living within it, right? So just use beautiful designs, match traditional architecture, and build it in such a way that it's not just a comfort from an aesthetic standpoint, but a comfort from, you touch the wall and you feel it and like this is a sturdy wall. It's not going down if you have like high wind loads with a hurricane that comes through, or, a northeastern, whatever the case may be. And so that's kind of like where we think about it. So you really want comfort on both levels. You need comfort all around the board, because all it takes is one of those cogs in the machine to say like no, and then it's not getting built, right?
Yeah. Yeah, really, really good point on that. And Missy, just to pick up what you kind of previously talked about, we're at an innovation summit. There are a lot of young, bold entrepreneurs looking for that angel round, seed round. Do you think there's an opportunity for philanthropy? And I'm out of the tech world for a while now, but are philanthropy groups getting into that angel round? Do you see a strategy for that as that initial disruptor? Let's put some money in something like, printing an ADU. Is there any of that movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's actually a lot of private capital chasing these innovative new companies, hopefully yours, because there's so much momentum behind them. I mean, in California in 2025, 19% of the new units built were ADUs. 19%. 1 in 5 new units was an ADU, and it's expected to go up to 25% in 2027. And I think what's exciting about this is that if private capital chasing a return is happy to be the capital that comes in to solve this, then great. From a philanthropic perspective, we're always looking at kind of who benefits from the innovative solutions, and at this point, many ADUs have a benefit that's largely accruing to the homeowner, who generally already has equity in their home. And I think, the key is, as Nick was talking about, we need to be able to build this for both the person who's going to be owner of the ADU and the prospective tenant. And hopefully, as this becomes more and more popular, we'll move from ADUs solving an intergenerational problem to let homeowners build something for their growing and extended family, into having ADUs that are really solving for the person in the community that needs affordable housing yet. And I think we need to get through that first wave of building until there's actually enough kind of excess supply that it starts to solve that problem.
Yeah, very good point. And I'm glad you brought up LA County. We talk about this in Connecticut politics and policy. I mean, that's a crazy percentage of housing new construction. And it is that kind of perfect world that we're talking about. There's policy changes, there's regulatory changes, there is innovation. Those pre-approved plans that Nick had talked about and Casey had talked about are in place. So we're seeing all of these great things come together that's working. And we'll close it up here with Abdul. New Haven, as we mentioned at the top of this, they want to grow. They want to be the biggest city in Connecticut. They're doing everything they can. They've really embraced ADUs on the policy side. We haven't seen a lot of ADUs being built in New Haven. So I don't want to close it on a downer. This is an opportunity question, but yeah, what do you see? I mean, this can work in other places, and we obviously know there's demand in New Haven. So what do you need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things is California is a great example, and I also think a lot of states and cities took the let's keep talking about ADUs maybe a little too far, in the extent that literally putting a phrase to something makes it this like whistle for people to get upset about or feel a little bit of like about, because it's just a unit. It is just a unit. You put it in your basement, in your attic, in the shed, you make a new one, it's just a unit. But once we made ADUs, there was put an ownership requirement on it. It has to have a particular form and shape and style. It might have to match the house that it's in. There were things that got attached to it. When otherwise, what we were doing, we have rules in our zoning that allows for conversions of your home to add additional units. And that is what someone would be doing otherwise. So I think what it is when we created our ADU policies in New Haven, they are just conversion-based still. They're not for new construction. Therefore, using your existing properties or buildings that you have. But what I would advocate for is to integrate within our broader residential requirements or regulations just what would be feasible to allow for an ADU to be built. So we don't have to name, when someone comes in and says, I'm building an ADU, I'll just say, great, where is it going to be? It's just a unit to me. Whatever it's going to look like, we just have to make sure that it meets building code. And we have to make sure that it meets these requirements. And I think it's an easing into the fact that units show up on land and in buildings in a variety of ways. And I think to what Missy was saying is like, think about what are the ways that you do that allow for any level of homeowner or prospective homeowner to get involved in the making of these units. I think a lot of when there's ADU interest in our communities, they're from folks who both are homeowners and are relatively well off. And that's a positive thing in that they have the capacity to go about making that, but it is solving the intergenerational issue. They're doing it because they have a family member to move into. It's not so much solving this is new housing for a person with immediate need and rent burden. And so if we're thinking about like the movement of getting ADUs or that unit into place for that purpose and that set of community members, then it's just kind of like regularizing it. Don't like call it out too much. Just make it chill. Like I think I take the like role of I'm in zoning just because I'm like I needed to calm down, not because I think that it is like altogether the like thing that solves every problem. I think this is one of the things is that we can just make it possible to build units. They fit in so many different ways. But if we put too much attention on the nature of how they fit, we sometimes start to make it harder to bring them about in the first place.
Well, I think if people came into this panel being very concerned about what are we doing about the housing crisis, hopefully some of these actors up here have shown that there's quite a bit of talent, quite a bit of innovation happening, and frankly, a lot of collaboration happening, which is really the name of the game for solving this crisis. So I first want to thank our panelists for being here. If we give a round of applause. And we have about 10 minutes left. I just wanted to open up to questions on anybody on the panelist. You, sir?
Yeah, this might be a little bit of a curveball here, but so I'm an architect, been in New Haven for 40 years, done some of these houses, done some of these the multifamily, and there's another dimension to this that I'm seeing as a resident of town, and that is we need an and. We also need to have, in this particular case, housing for young families that are coming out of all these apartments that we built in New Haven, in order to keep them in New Haven. Our schools are becoming emptied because of the population. If we don't do anything about it in New Haven, and this goes to Abdul's case, and this is market rate family ownership like my kids are having across the country. I don't see anybody addressing any of that, and especially in New Haven, we want to. If you take a look at the city, how do we make this city more well-rounded, more successful in the future? It's going to have to be building on more families in this community.
I think maybe Abdul, you can.
I can start. I mean, I think so much of this is what is the concept of a starter home in 2026? That is like not the concept that most people had otherwise. Everyone, I think, still holds a logic that your starter home will be a single family home. And so you might move out of New Haven to acquire that and search for that. And you might get the financing from a local bank for that kind of thing. In reality, a starter home is starting to look like a condo. It's starting to look like a unit within a 2-3 family, or if there's rarely ever a actual new condo, large scale development being built, then maybe in that. And I think part of it is this is less of a zoning thing, I think, but I think there's an aspect to like provide zoning that produces that scale of, 2-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units, that scale. But I think there's an aspect of like financing and all of the like supports for new and prospective homeowners to enter into those markets to like take up those units once they come about. Because I know there are there's properties that exist within New Haven that could turn over to being condos, could turn over if Connecticut wanted to try it into cooperatives, could turn over into a lot of forms of ownership that are more accessible and affordable for people right now that meet the kind of starter home gap that we currently have. I imagine a world in which we're going to make a lot of new single family homes to meet the particular need that's showing up to keep folks here. But I do think we have to adjust the mindset and adjust all of the supports for that mindset to let people stay in the variety of homes that are going to be made available under kind of current standards. But not a perfect, but yeah.
Next question, I think I had a hand up over here or someone. Yes, you.
I wanted to ask about new building versus renovation versus augmentation for, I guess, methods to adjust the prices. So I guess like in the past, what methods were preferred and now what methods are preferred, like depending on what situations?
That might be a Nick question.
I could take a stab. Yeah. I mean, back in the day, we used to build a lot of single family and multifamily with stick, so like wood. 93% of homes are built with wood in the US. And that was relatively inexpensive with the labor workforce and like how people were trained, the materials, et cetera. Now it's becoming a lot more expensive. So I would say ADU construction, which is a lot smaller from a footprint standpoint, augmentation, and then like renovation, those are becoming a lot hotter right now because it's just so difficult not only to build affordably, but also find land that's affordable as well. It's like double-edged sword there. And so if somebody's going to come in to the market and actually reduce starter home prices and like build starter homes to increase the supply, right, you need to do it a lot more affordably, like significantly more affordably, and actually go on the market more affordably. And we're trying to do that, right? And I think there are ways to do it. You just have to be very strategic about, going back to the comfort, because there's just so many different factors at play that can really stop something in its tracks or make it so that the costs go up, right? From a return standpoint, if your construction timeline balloons, then suddenly, your cost is going to go up, even if the materials remain the same in terms of price, because now you got labor that's on the job site, different subcontractors, they're taking more time up, et cetera, right? And then your return timeline reduces. So it's all about building quickly, affordably, and safely, right? And I think we can do that with some of the innovative construction solutions, not just mine, but other solutions are in the market. So I think that new construction will become hot again.
So the governor's going to come in and speak at opening remarks here shortly. I'm curious, if you could ask the state to make one big bet, like a generational bet that would change the housing supply in Connecticut, what would you ask the state to do?
I think I'll start with that, and in case you go too. So I have a hashtag that's 5 by 50 CT. We want 5 million people in Connecticut by 2050. It's 3.6 million people now. I would ask the governor, and I have asked the governor this. He doesn't give me a good answer. How do you plan for another 1.5 million people coming to Connecticut? And to some degree, we had a very big success in the special session 2025. And when I'm asked this question other times, I say remove parking requirements. There is no magic button, otherwise somebody would have hit it. But for Connecticut, it was certainly a matter of getting rid of parking, unlocks quite a bit of infill density in our cities like New Haven and Bridgeport, Hartford. So we were able to get that done sort of in Connecticut. But after that, I think this land of steady habits in Connecticut, it's more about what are we doing here? Like, what do we want Connecticut to be? And then that's a different conversation. But I don't know, Casey.
No, I mean, along those lines, it's really related to opening up land that's just sitting there underutilized. And the reason it's underutilized is because our zoning codes don't allow us to maximize its potential. We think about opportunities for transit-oriented development and how we can support more development around train stations, different bus systems that we have, but people can't get things built, and it's really expensive to build, and it's only continuing to be expensive because of the things like parking requirements, or minimizing like how much density can be there, and so it's not able to maximize the value. That's a huge challenge that we have in trying to support development that also allows for affordability, because it's a both and, right? Like, it'd be great to have extra people here in the state, but we know that not all of those individuals are going to be at 150% or more AMI where they can afford, luxury and housing. So we need to really think about strategies that allow for both the housing at all income levels, right? When we think about affordable housing, everybody needs a place to live, and it's affordable to them at their income, and we have to be thinking about that.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk much about, but all of us, I think, would agree, it's political leadership at the municipal level, the state level matters a great deal. And we did just have Congress pass the Road to Housing 21st Century. That's the first big federal bill in 30 plus years. So, the YIMBY movement is getting in front of decision makers in a very positive way, but there still are political contingencies that are status quo bias, that don't want things to change, don't see themselves in the change, and that takes political leadership in addition to some of the folks up here. Last question, sir in the back.
Who do you know that wants 5.5 million people in Connecticut?
What was it? Sorry?
Who do you know that wants 5.5 million people in Connecticut?
I know a lot of taxpayers that would want 5.5 million people. Okay, well, I think we do have one more. Did you have your hand up, ma'am?
Just very quickly, when you talk about affordability, are you also including people reaching retirement age and are in need of housing, and most of them will stay there until they're taken out because I mean, they stay there until they pass on.
Aging in place.
Yeah, and that's from what I see and hear and have witnessed with relatives, that's an issue, finding affordable housing that addresses the needs that they have within that age bracket, and it is affordable. So is that part of this whole landscape of affordability and inclusiveness relative to housing?
Maybe Missy, you want to close things up?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think so much of this comes back to supply and demand, and it hits on some of the other questions that were asked here, that many folks who are, at retirement age and nearing the elderly stage, they still need a place to live. And so to the extent that we are able to build more housing for everyone and, reduce zoning requirements, make it easier to build ADUs, make it easier, faster, cheaper to be able to build multifamily units, it unlocks affordability for everyone. And to answer your specific question, certainly it is a set of constituents that we look at closely, both because they need a home and because those individuals downsizing unlocks some of the starter family homes as well. So it's a great set to be focused on.
All right. I think we're going to let you all get back out to the conference. Thank you so much for being here today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
We're spread out.